Hello, this is the State Archives webinar for New South Wales probate records. We are going to be looking at probate packets and related records held in the New South Wales State Archives collection. We're going to start by looking at what is probate. Because we sometimes have a bit of difficulty understanding that in the reading room. Okay, so a grant of probate is a good place to start. Now, this is the legal document that authorises an executor to manage the estate of a deceased person according to what they wanted in their will. The grant of probate confirms that the will is valid, so it's a legal document, that the person has actually passed away, and that the executors named in the will have the right to administer that estate. And the probate packet is just what holds the paperwork created in that process. So it's all folded up and popped in an envelope, and that's called the probate packet. We're going to look at some helpful definitions just because they're words that come up when you're dealing with probate packets and other associated records. The first is the executor. Now, the executor's the person who's named in the will, or the people, to administer the estate of the deceased. So that's the person that the deceased person trusts to carry out their wishes. They have to determine what belongs to that estate, they pay any debts, and then they distribute the estate to those entitled to it. The estate, when we talk about that, we're talking about their property, so their real estate, their land, houses, that kind of thing, and also the personal property of the deceased, so their personal belongings. A grant of probate is the authority given by the court to the executor to deal with the deceased estates and to certify that that will is the valid legal document. Then we have letters of administration. These are given when there is no valid will or where there is no executor or the executor is unable to carry out their function. So the Supreme Court issues letters for someone else to carry out that function as executor. If someone is testate, it means that they've died leaving a valid will. So they're often referred to as the testator. And of course, if you die intestate, that means you die without leaving a valid will. So there is no valid will. There's no executor, and the Supreme Court issues letters of administration to deal with the estate. So in this talk today, we're going to be looking at probate documents and related deceased estate records. The first thing that we're going to look at are the probate packets. These cover 1817 to 1976 and 1989. We're going to look at will books, which cover the time period about 1800 to 1984. We'll look at some early probate records, 1790 to 1875, and these are not part of the series of probate packets, but kind of work alongside them. We'll look at deceased estate files, which cover 1880 to 1958, and records from the Curator of Intestate Estate, his case papers, which cover 1821 to 1913. So we're going to start by looking at probate packets and what makes them special. One of the first things to know is that there's probate packets for many people who died in New South Wales, all those people who had property, and not just men. So often in the 19th century, records that survive relate to men and they're doing in the world. And if you do find documents relating to women, it's often to do with birth, death and marriage records. Probate packets, yes, related to death, but they also can give us a glimpse into what a lady or a woman was doing at the time of her death, what she owned and what she was involved in. So they're a useful source from that point of view. Most of the probate packets held in our collection are listed in our catalogue collection search, and they're listed by the name of the deceased. So that's very good. It means that they're indexed. You can look up the person's name in the catalogue and see if there's a probate packet there for that person. As we said before, we've got 1817 to 1976 and probate packets from 1989 in the collection. Often you get more than the deceased's will in the probate packet, and it's good to know that they're open to public access from 5 years after the granting of probate. So every probate packet held at State Archives is open to public access. And you can come into the reading room to look at them, or you can also get copies of them for a fee through our copying service. And that's a situation where you mail order a photocopy of a file, we do the copies and we post them to you for a fee. And often there may be related records to the probate packets. So things like an entry in a will book, maybe a deceased estate file, or if there's no probate packet, you could also check there's a file from the Curator of Intestate Estates. So we think they're very special at State Archives. Now, when you're looking for probate packets, we do have some guides and finding aids that can you. The first thing to know about is our collection search, which is our catalogue. And this is on our homepage on our website. I'll show you how to use that in a second. We've also got the index, the Supreme Court of New South Wales Probate Index, which indexes probate packet or probates granted in New South Wales between 1800 and 1985. So in the collection, we've got records up to 1976, but the index covers those a little bit later, up to 1985. And there's also a guide to probate packets on our website. When you look for the Research A to Z on our homepage and click on that, scroll down to P and you'll see the Probate Packets guide there. And that will explain some of the background to the probate packets and also how to research those packets and what you can find in them. Now, where do you start? That's a very good question. So we suggest probably having a name is a good place to begin with. So particularly with 19th century records and people, allow for differences in spelling. So as New South Wales at the time was a real melting pot of cultures and dialects and accents. Not everybody could read like they can today, so of course you've got to allow for how something was pronounced and how it might have been heard by the person right. So Australian newspapers, and it goes right up to the present day. So it's very handy. And you can search by the name of the deceased, and it will often provide either the name, the date that the death notice went in, the date of death, and also the details of funeral notices as well. You can also find death years in the New South Wales birth, death and marriage indexes. These don't show a death date, but they do show the year of death, so that can be helpful. And then the probate probate notices in the New South Wales Government Gazette or the newspapers of the day, and these are now available on the Trove website, trove.nla.gov.au. In the State Archives collection, we hold probate packets from when they started back in 1817 right up to 1976. So the highest number that we store here is Series 4, number 828673. And then we also hold part of 1989, so the first 3,050 packets from 1989. The remainder of the packets that aren't held at State Archives are still held by the Supreme Court. So they created the records and they keep a hold of those records for a period of time before they transfer them to State Archives. And at the moment, they've transferred up to 1976 and a bit of that 1989 period. When you're looking for probate packets, most of them are listed in collection search, but there is a gap, and it's a fairly significant gap. So we don't have listed from Series 4, number 1, up to Series 4, 152, 150, so that time period 1890 to 1928. Yes, we hold the probate packets in the collection, but no, they are not listed on collection search. So if you're looking for someone whose probate was granted in 1922, you will not find that person in collection search. There is an exception to the 1890 to 1928, and that's the World War I era probate packets, 1914, 1918. Those packets have been recently listed, and it was a centenary of Anzac project, which was funded by the New South Wales Bar Association, the Law Society of New South Wales, and the Supreme Court of New South Wales. I'll show you how to find some of the not listed online probate packets later, but just to remember, it's basically nothing between 1890 to 1928, except for the 1914-18 records, which are listed these days. The Supreme Court has divided the probate packets into 5 groupings, which they call series. And pretty much we don't know why, possibly because of the size of each series, possibly because of some sort of statutory change or in-house change at the Supreme Court, who knows. But anyway, you can see that there's 5 different series there. The first one's 1817 to 1873. By far the biggest would be Series 4, which is 1890 to 1985. Now, to find a probate packet in collection search, we're just going to have a little example of how to do that. So we suggest entering the person's name and the word death. So in this example, James Stedman death, click on the search button and then click on the entry to go to your search screen. So we'll have a look at that now, just to show you. Just waiting to catch up there a little bit. Screens are a little bit slow. Here we go. So this is just a copy I've made from our website. Up the top there I've got our search bar, which is what you can see on our homepage. I've just put the words James Stedman death and clicked on the search button here, that magnifying glass. What I'll then see is all the probate packets that have the words James Stedman in them, and they're all listed below. So the person I'm looking for is a James Noble Stedman. I can see that there are 2. One dies 1964, one dies 1944. I know because I know my date of death that I'm looking for 1944. So I then just click on that line and then I go to the item detail page. So from this screen here, I can click on copy service and order a photocopy of that record for a fee to be posted to me, 20 working days from date of receipt of payment and order. I can pre-order, so I can get the records brought up to the reading room on a specified date. Then I can go into the reading room and view them. And I can also see the probate number here. So if I'm pre-ordering or requesting in the reading room, I need to know this Series 4 number here, so Series 4 293 226, and the name of the deceased, so James Noble Stedman. reading room, we'll get up to 4 packets for you in advance of your visit to the reading room. We just want your details, so your name, a contact information, email, telephone number, your reader's ticket number, and then details of the 4 probate packets you want to look at. When you come into the reading room, they'll be sitting there ready and waiting for you. And then once you're there, you can request further packets to look at once you've arrived in the reading room. And we can do up to 16 packets or something on a long day. Now, this is the last will of James Noble Stedman from that 1944 probate packet. So it's a beautifully typed document. It tells us all we need to know. It's signed by the witnesses down the bottom there, and shows how he's dividing up his property upon his death. There's also, as I was saying before, a lot of probate packets which are not listed online. Now, there's a few different ways that you can find the probate numbers for these packets. The first way that we would suggest is by looking at the Supreme Court's Probate Index, covering 1800 to 1984. This is available on microfiche in the reading rooms, and a lot of public libraries and research centres across New South Wales particularly have copies of the Probate Index. So it's quite a simple matter to look that up, look for your person and write down the details next to their name. Another thing you can do, and I'll show you later, is to look at the back of the deceased estate file for the person. But either way that you find it, you need to write down the person's probate number, the series number, so is it series 1, 2, 3 or 4, and of course their names. It's important to remember that probate packets are arranged by the date probate is granted, not the date of death. So probate could be granted a couple of months after someone dies, that's fine, but it could take 5, 10, 15, we've seen 20 years between when the person passed away and when the probate was granted. So it's important to remember that it might take quite some time before that person's probate is granted. This is a copy of the New South Wales Supreme Court's Probate Index. You can see in the far left-hand column there, we've got the probate numbers. So we need, of course, to know that number. And then in the second column there, we've got the series number. So that's whether it's a 1, 2, 3 or 4. Important to know because each time series 1, series 2, series 3, series 4 all start at number 1. So if you don't get the right series, you won't get the right probate number. And then going across, you've got the person's name, where they lived, their date of death, and the instrument. So here they're just talking about whether it's a P for probate being granted or an A for letters of administration being granted on that estate. So whether they had a will really or whether they didn't. And blowing up just my particular example, we're looking for Elizabeth Throsby this time. She's a series 4, 215, just there. And then going across, we see that she died at Moss Vale in 1891. Now, things you might find in a probate packet include documents such as the last will and testament and any codicils to that will. You might see the letters of administration where there wasn't a will. Of course, you wouldn't necessarily see a will and letters of administration unless there was some sort of problem with validating the will. So often letters of administration are if the person died without a will or if the executors are unable to carry out their function, and then there was an application for the letters of administration. You might see an inventory or a list of all the things the person owned at the time of their death, so an inventory of the estate. You will probably see affidavits of death and or a copy of the death certificate. More unusual to see the copy of the death certificate, but they are in there. Affidavits sworn by the executors. Orders relating to the filing of accounts. A copy of the summary cover sheet, Affidavit D, we'll see one of those later. The executor's petition for probate, and the grant of probate itself. So yay, sounds like a lot of legal documents, but there are some interesting things you can find out about your deceased within the packet. The first thing that you're going to see is a copy of Elizabeth Throsby's will. So it's beautifully calligraphied there, and there's her signature right in the middle of the page. And the next example that you'll see when it comes up is the codicil of her will. Now you can see the fold marks down the document if you look closely, and that's because the Supreme Court folded all the probate documents up to quite a small size and popped them all into a quite thin envelope, and they're stored folded. So occasionally documents do come out in not very good conditions because they've been folded for so long, and it also makes them a little bit difficult if you're photographing, but that's how they did it, so there's not much we can do about that. The next document that you're going to see is the consent for letters of administration to be issued. And this is a document in this particular situation which was signed by the man's widow, John McHugh's widow, and all 7 of his children, and has the added advantage of showing the married names of all the daughters and includes all of their signatures there. So it's quite a wonderful document itself. And the next example, we pop back to Elizabeth Throsby again. So this time what we've got are documents which show the inventory of Elizabeth's estate. So this time we start with a list of all of her livestock. So in this case, she's got some cows and a horse and 2 calves and how much each of them are worth. And then on the right side there, we've got a valuation of all the furniture at the Throsby Park house. So her Paris lace curtains, her card tables, her hanging wardrobes, the blankets and the pillows and the bolster, etc., etc., etc. And the next page going across, we have the valuation of the furniture at the cottage at Throsby Park, Mosvale. And that goes room by room through each area of the house, listing all the items in each room and how much they're worth. And then on the right-hand side, which is another interesting document, we've got a list of all the rents that were due to the estate of the deceased at the time of her deceased. So that's an interesting document to see as well. The next document that we're going to see is a later inventory of the estate. So this is a lady who dies in 1963. The earlier lady was 1891, and by this time all of the records, of course, are typed as much as they can be. And you'll see there's a list of all the value of all Margaret Bradley's real estate, the total value of her furniture, her watches, what she had in the banks, and what was owing to her from an insurance policy as well. Much easier to read. And in this case, we've also got the volume and the folio numbers which relate to the Torrens Title Register, which you can see online through the Land and Property Information's Historical Land Records Viewer. We're not going to look at those documents today, but there are a handy onwards thing from the probate and the deceased estate files that you can then get into details about the land that the person owned at the time of their death. The next documents that you're going to see are the affidavit of death of the deceased. That's the blue one on the right there. So this is for John Thompson Blair. Alexander Callan is saying that John Thompson Blair died on the 15th of June 1959 and that Alexander Callan knew him well, saw his dead body after his decease, and he had been well acquainted with the deceased and for how long. And on the left-hand side, of course, you've got the death certificate. And as I was saying, you don't always get death certificates in a deceased estate file. It's more common where there might be a couple of marriages. It's range of different children, and possibly some question as to whether they've picked everybody up and who's actually entitled to the estate. So it's a lucky happening, I guess, in this context when we do get a death certificate in a deceased estate file. The next thing that we see is a copy of the Affidavit D. So this is also something you see in a deceased estate file. So you'll see these again coming up in the future. And basically this document is looking at how much did the person own at their time of their death and how much were the debts owing to by the estate worth. And then how much is the final balance of the estate. So James Noble Stedman, a manufacturing confectioner, who dies in 1944 at the age of 83, owned an estate worth £56,525 and 8 pence. It's a fair amount of money, I would conjecture, for that time period. When you open up the form, so it's 4 pages, and then often there's documents pinned together to the inside. We've got the back of the front page of the form there, which lists all the assets of the estate and their worth. And then there's documents listing the different items in his estate. So it's his house and his land, the various houses and land there actually, and the volume and the folio numbers. So quite helpful again if you're wanting to go on to research the land owned by James Noble Stedman, who of course had that first will that we looked at the beginning of the talk. The next document here is the affidavit of the executrices, in this case, not executors. So his 2 daughters, Mildred Margaret and Beatrix Elizabeth, were the executors. They swear that they believe that they've got the last will and testament, that James Noble had real and personal estate within New South Wales, and that they were going to pay all the legacies and debts owing from the estate. The next documents are quite interesting. So here we've got the notice of motion by the executrices, which is the wordings on the left-hand side there, and on the back of that form is the comment granted and the date that the probate was granted. And this is the grant of probate. So it's not a special typed up sealed document or anything like that. It's usually an annotation on the back of the notice of motion, which is something to be aware of there. The next estate that we're going to pop back to is John McHugh. So this was that deceased estate, the intestate estate, which we were looking at earlier, where they listed all the wife and all the children with the signatures. So in this case, they're saying that there was 2 marriages. The first wife died in 1915. He married again 15 years later, didn't have any children. And this is the affidavit of administration by one of the sons. And the next page, which is popping up now, what you see is the notice of search on the left-hand side, where they say that they've done all the proper things to look for a will without any success. And then on the right, we've got the notice of motion again with the words granted and the 20th of the 12th, 1945. So that's the date that the probate was granted. So again, not the fantastic form, just the annotation on the back of the notice of motion there. And I've just got a couple of interesting examples to show you here. So the first is a World War I probate. So this is actually a soldier who passed away in 1918, December 1918. On the front there you see the notice of death of bronchopneumonia in 1918. And on the left-hand side there, we've got the will. And so they all had to do wills before they left New South Wales. And this one's just really poignant because he's clearly quite young. He's left everything he's got to his mum, and then his life insurance policy and if his mother passes away before him, then that money's to be paid to his sister Lizzie. And so it's a little bit sad really there. But that's how they did it. And you see the wills on all sorts of things on the backs of photographs pulled out of their army booklets and all sorts of things. So it's just a beautiful. And the final example that we've got today is from Charles Kingsford Smith's Probate Packet. Now, of course, he was flying over the jungles of Borneo and his plane went down, went missing, assumed dead. And so there's a whole swathe of documents in the probate packet looking at the lengths that they went to try and recover him and find out what happened. So there was a notice that was distributed. It was actually dropped over the jungles in Borneo. Up the top there you've got the English translation, and then further down the Malay translation, and then the Chinese translation as well. So the efforts that they went to. Then we've got a document from London, or the British legature in Bangkok, just commenting about the efforts that they went to look for him. Quite interesting. And then popping up on the right any second now, the blue document, which was an extract from Hansard. So they again reported to Parliament all the efforts that they went to try and find Charles Kingsford Smith, and including quite detailed account of what, and there's a couple of accounts in there as well, Kingsford Smith's life and his death, which will be interesting, particularly if you were researching his death in great detail. So just some final tips and reminders to do with probate packets. Remember, you can pre-order up to 4 records before you come into the reading room. You'll need to know the probate packet number and the series number and the name of the deceased. For most of those people, you can get those on our website, but where you can't, you can also look on the Probate Index microfiche or the deceased estate files. So sometimes you might come to the reading room, get those numbers and take them home to send them back for next time. The retrieval times in the reading room, because probates are so highly in demand, we manage the demand by just going to get the records at certain times of the day. So we do 4 runs. And you can check retrieval times on the day with staff before you go. So you can get up to 16 probate packets on a particular day. If there's 2 of you coming together, that's 32 probate packets, which is probably enough for anybody in one day, really. And if you can't come into the reading room and you've got a particularly important probate packet or some that you're really curious about, you can order a photocopy of the probate packet through our copy order service. There's a fee, and as I said, there's a 20 working day turnaround time from the date that the fee's paid and the order is received. Now, moving along, we are going to look at will books. So these are just transcriptions of original wills, which were originally handwritten into books, hence the name will books. And then more recently, they were typed up and bound into volumes as well. So we've got will books in the collection from the beginning right up to 1984, and then microfilmed up to October 1952. And an interesting side fact is that in the beginning of the 20th century, the handwritten copies were compiled by members of the Australian cricket team, pretty much because a senior member of the court was also chairman of the cricket board, and that's what the cricket team did in their off-season, so it kept them out of trouble and off the streets. The will books are available on microfilm in the reading room and also on the Find My Past website. So that's all of those microfilmed will books up to 1952. You can see on the Find My Past website or on microfilm in the reading room. The later ones, it's the original record, so you'd need to request that from the reading room. They work with the same numbering system as the probate packets. So with Elizabeth Throsby, for example, she was Series 4215. In the will books, she's still Series 4215. And here she is. On the left-hand side, you've got the probate packet, And on the right-hand side, they've copied out the entire codicil as well. So you can see both of those documents there. The next page that we've got is also just for people who had letters of administration through the Supreme Court. So again, you've got the probate number for that particular person, and then just to say that the estate was administered rather than probated there. So that's all of the examples really on that page. Next, we're looking at some early probate, which were created by the early probate papers, so a register of wills, which covers 1817 to 24. So all up, that covers about 1790. We'll mention in those three records on the index to early probate records. So it's something you can check anytime really, that you've got someone up to 1875. You never know. So in this example, we've picked on Anne Baker. So she died in 1810. We've got the real number and the 5-stroke number to look at there to see the original probate document records, well, in this case, the microfilmed records. And there we are. There is her letter of administration to do with the processing of her deceased estate back in 1810. Now, another tricky thing to do with those early probates and the early colonial secretaries' papers. So we've also got the colonial secretaries' papers from 1788 to 1825 listed on the website. These are quite handy because they're a very comprehensive collection of documents to do with that very early colonial history. And people are listed in there for all sorts of reasons, because they have letters to the colonial secretary for all sorts of reasons. So here what I've done is I've looked up Anne Baker. We've got a letter referred to do with the guardianship of her son Abraham. So obviously this is to do with her probate, and there's also there the mention to do with Abraham, the guardianship of him as the son of Anne Baker. You've got the reference numbers to look at the records. And so if I went to the microfilm and looked up that record on reel 6002, I could then see the letter to do with the guardianship of Abraham. And that's a copy of the letter here. So you can look at those letters on Ancestry. They're widely available on microfilm in many public libraries and research centres, and also, of course, at State Archives in the reading room. You can see them there. So it's just a little bit of extra dimension. The next records that we're going to look at are the deceased estate files. Now, these don't cover as long as the probate packets. These cover 1880 to 1958. And the reason that they were created was to work out the value of the estate that a person owned at the time of their death. So they're looking at everything the person owned at the time of their death, how much it was worth, and then how much death duty or tax could be charged on that estate. So the filing system for which we have records was first created in 1880. They established a death duties branch of the Stamp Duties Office in 1920, and finally abolished death duty in 1981. We hold the deceased estate files from 1880 to 1958, not up to 1981, but for later documents that you would find ordinarily in a deceased estate file, you can also look into the probate packet, and because quite often there's copies between the files that are very similar. So much of the deceased estate file for the later files is also in the probate packets. With the earlier deceased estate files, we always suggest looking at both if there are two to check, because you never quite know which one's going to be better. Now, the deceased estate files are indexed. Originally, they were just indexed on microfilm. They've covered 1880 to 1958 and, of course, available for searching in the reading room. More recently, Ancestry has copied the 1923 to 58 indexes. These are card indexes and they just cover discrete periods of time, just alphabetical, and the cards show you details like the person's name, date of death, date duty paid, how much their estate was worth and how much death duty was paid and what their occupation was, and also the file number to get into the deceased estate file. So very important for that. They do give you some information all on their own, but if you take that file number down, then you can look at the deceased estate file as well. And for that very early 1880 to 1923 period, we've listed those files on our website in our online indexes. So it's D for deceased estate files rather than early probates, which was P. And you can see they're listed 1880 to 1923 people, as well as some of the 1924 to 39 people. Just as an aside, if you're looking at someone who might have had a probate, you might look at the deceased estate file index first to get a hint as to whether they had a deceased estate file and therefore whether they might have had a probate packet as well. So the deceased estate file index is quite useful for that. All sorts of documents show up in a deceased estate file. So we've got that affidavit D again, which we saw a copy of from James Noble Stedman, more common in 20th century probate pack. You might see correspondence, stat decks, that kind of thing in the probate deceased estate file. You will see valuations and schedules of real and personal property. You will probably see calculations and statements of assessable duty, given that's the point of the files. You will probably see the probate number written on the back of the file, although there's some probate deceased estate files for people who did not go to the hassle of going through probate as well. And in some files you get a copy of the original will that was lodged with the Supreme Court. Usually it's a typed up copy, and not every deceased estate file will have a copy of the will in it, so only some will have it. Here we've got a copy of a very early deceased estate file. This is from 1897, and Arthur Carter, who was a miner in West Wyalong. He died in 1896. His widow was doing the deceased estate parts there. On the right-hand side, which is the inside of that form, they've put down that he owned one horse draft, a draft horse, and one dray. And moving through the file there, we can see, when it pops up on your screens, we can see that we've also got a valuation of his real estate there. So he had some allotments there in the town of Berrigan, or parish of Berrigan, sorry. And on the back of the form, this is the very back of the deceased estate file. I've circled the probate number in red. So if I looked up Series 4 13356, I would see Arthur Carter's probate packet as well. So it's handy to know he's died in that time period that probate packets are not listed online. So I can look at the deceased estate file, get the probate packet number, and then go for the probate packet without having to go near the probate index on microfiche if I don't want to. So with the early probate packet, getting mixed up, the early deceased estate files, one doesn't always get a huge quantity of documentation. You do if people were well off, and we've noticed from time to time that people who own stores, so the general storekeeper from a town, for example, there might actually be an inventory of all the goods that were on sale in the store. So that's another interesting side note. And of course, if people were well off, it'd go through and list all their personal and real estate as well. Just harking back to our example of Charles Kingsford Smith, here we've got his affidavit D. You'll notice that there's a number in the top in the square. That's his deceased estate file number. And then we've got his age. We know that he died in 1935. The value of his estate, £12,874, 15 shillings and 7 pence. And on the right-hand side here, we've got a summary list of his real estate and other sorts of possessions there, including down the bottom, the Gloria Triumph motor car worth £150. On the next screen here, we've got some more schedules of belongings. So this is all the summaries of his furniture, his watches, trinkets, jewelry, his government stock, his mortgages. On schedule number 9, you can see there that he owned some aeroplane engines and propeller hubs and other quite appropriate interests that Charles Kingsford Smith had, all the belongings he kept, and can sort of add up to a bit of a picture of the kind of person he was maybe, or what he did in his life. The certificates of valuations, this is just an example here, quite wonderful because it gives you a very good description of a particular property as well as the volume and folio number sometimes. It tells you exactly where it was in terms of the portion and the parish and the estate name and how much it was worth. And then down the bottom, the improvements comprised. So that's the kind of cottage in this situation that it was. So that's helpful and useful information if you're researching the land that Charles Kingsford Smith owned at the time of his death. The next page that we've got here is a list of trinkets, souvenirs and medallions and household effects for Charles Kingsford Smith. So this is really going through all those little bits and pieces. He's got his trophies and his little models and the pewter plates and everything, the grandfather clocks and the coffee services and those sorts of things, and how much each thing is worth. And that was the job of the valuer, to go and value every single little item in the estate. And so we've also got lists of the charms and the other things that he was given over time. So I imagine almost everywhere he went, he won something or was given something as he was feted around the world. Also, to continuing with our famous people run through deceased estate files, this one is a different example for a different person. This is Robert Louis Stevenson, who died on Samoa in 1894. Now, he has a deceased estate file because he had a bank account in Australia. It's the only thing he had in Australia was a bank account. And you do find that from time to time, that even if people didn't live in New South Wales, but they had property or stocks or shares or something like that, they could also have a deceased estate file in New South Wales. So the strangest people pop up when you least expect them. We do have one for Rudyard Kipling, Dame Nellie Melba, for example, because they own stocks and shares and other sorts of property in New South Wales, even though they didn't actually live in New South Wales. This next one is for Miles Franklin, the famous authoress. I wanted to show you this document because of the document on the right-hand side of the screen there. So often you'll see something like this in a deceased estate file where it lists everything the people who are mentioned in the will, the people who are entitled to a share in the estate, and it will show you what So in this case, there's some children of her brother who are listed as heirs to her estate, and they're all listed there, and often they'll tell you the portion of the share that those people were entitled to from that estate. So that could be a handy document to look out for. And the last sequence, or the last series of records we're going to look at today, come from the Curator of Intestate Estates. So trusteeship is where the state administers the will, and there are times when trusteeship was granted to the civil courts, so the Court of Civil Jurisdiction or the Supreme Court. In 1947, they started this office called the Curator of Intestate Estates. And this curator could administer the estate of a deceased person if that deceased person was intestate and had no direct heirs, so there was no will, no direct heirs. If the executors had renounced probate, so for some reason they weren't going to do it. If no one had applied for probate within 3 months, if the estate was likely to go to waste, if the executors and next of kin couldn't be found. So then they could make an application for the curator to administer that estate. In 1913, the Office of the Public Trustee was established, and that office took over the functions of the Curator of Intestate Estates. And now they're called the Trustee and Guardian in New South Wales. So we hold case papers from the Curator of Intestate Estates. The papers start in 1821 and they go right up to 1913. So the sorts of things that you find in there are details to do with the amounts of money court concerning the administration of the estate. You might find affidavits of debt. You might find personal correspondence, circulars from shareholders, newspaper cuttings. You might find inventories of the estate. You might find details about where they've tried to look for family members. So they're a very interesting set of files. You should see the Intestate Estates Guide on our website in the Research A to Z. That will give you further information. Now, researching the case papers is a fairly straightforward affair. All of the papers these days are indexed on our website. So from 1821 to 1930, our online indexes and I for Intestate Estates, and you'll see the index listing all of the people who have those files listed there. So you need to write down the year, the case number and the box number, all of which are shown on the index, and of course the person's name. So you can pre-order those. The files are held at our Western Sydney Records Centre at Kingswood, so you can pre-order before you come. We can also get them when you come in, or you can order a photocopy of that file via the photocopy order service. So this is where we again do that mail order thing where for a fee we'll provide a photocopy of the whole file for you within 20 working days. So there's a few different ways that you can get access to those records. Our last example for the day relates to an actress called Ada Lee. Now you can find a bit of a biography about Ada Lee online, and also a couple of marvellous photographs of her. She was a burlesque actress who worked around the colonies in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, but she had the fortune, well probably misfortune really, to come to Sydney in 1902 when we were having an issue with the bubonic plague. And unfortunately she caught the plague and she died at the Coast Hospital and that's the Criterion Hotel. And then she died at the Coast Hospital, poor lady. She was 41 years old at the time, and it gives her some details about her age and birthplace and next of kin. On the left-hand side there's the instructions for the application for the administration of her estate. flicking slowly over to the next screen there, we have the statutory declaration of death on the left-hand side. So this confirmed that she died on the 1st of March 1902. And as far as they know, she wasn't married, she was a spinster. And the letter on the right-hand side is from her sister Jenny Lee, and she's the eldest sister, and she'd like to have the estate administered, please. So poor old Ada Lee, she came for work and just never left. The next page that we're flicking over to eventually is an inventory of her estate. So this is quite interesting. It's been made up by the police. Look at the address up the top there, number 1 police station, March the 7th, 1902, so a week after her death. And they've listed all the property that she left behind. So this is interesting because it's all the stuff that a lady actress might carry when one's touring the colonies for work, for example. So she had 53 jackets and blouses, 27 skirts, coats, and there. And on the right-hand side, she brought 13 pairs of boots. Very pleased to see that as a shoe person myself. And all the other things that she had, including a revolver. So perhaps for protection, I'm assuming, and a clock and some books and papers and photos there. So that's all of her property that she left, which it's a really interesting picture of what was important to her in her place and time for her work that she did. So quite amazing files, really, the intestate estate case papers. We're just about we are wrapping up the talk now. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope that we've given you some tips and tricks for researching probate packets and the associated records in the State Archives collection of New South Wales. So remembering it's people who had estates passed through the Supreme Court, passed through the Stamp Duty's Office of New South Wales. So people who died with property in New South Wales may have had a probate packet or an intestate estate case papers. They may have had a deceased estate file as well. Wealth of information. With the deceased estate files and the probate packets, very difficult to know which is going to be the better file to have a look at. As always, we recommend that you look at both if there's the possibility of doing so, particularly if you're doing it in the rename. And other probate packets are arranged by the date that probate is granted, and that could be anywhere from a couple of months up to years and years after when the person passed away. Good to know death dates, good to know the name of the deceased, well, very handy to know the name of the deceased, but also quite handy to know the date of death if you possibly can, whether it's this John Smith or that John Smith's probate that you might need to look at. So we'd love to see you in the reading room looking at their packets. We wish you all the best, and we're sure that we'll see you soon. So thank you very much for your attention today. Thank you.